The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting the desert in hues of orange and crimson. We had been driving for what felt like an eternity, 4 hours at least, with nothing but open road and scrubland in every direction. The highway stretched ahead like an uncoiling serpent, leading us deeper into a wasteland of rock and sand. The air conditioner in my old Toyota was barely keeping up, and a thin layer of sweat clung to my skin. Next time we're flying, Eric groaned from the back seat, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his hoodie. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and the weariness in his voice matched the energy in the car, low and sluggish. I don't care how much the tickets cost. I'd rather sell a kidney than drive through this hell again. Lena, my girlfriend, snorted from the passenger seat, adjusting her sunglasses as she stared out at the desolate landscape. I told you we should have taken the main route. At least there would have been some civilization out there, maybe even a decent motel. She turned to me, her lips curling into a smirk, but knew we had to take your shortcut, which, by the way, hasn't saved us any time. I sighed. She had a point. The so-called shortcut had turned out to be a barren strip of asphalt, devoid of any signs of life. For miles now we hadn't seen another car, let alone a gas station, diner, or anything resembling human presence. The road signs had long faded, and my GPS had lost signal about an hour ago. Relax, I said, forcing a grin. We'll hit a town soon enough. Worst case, we get a killer sunset out of this. Eric groaned dramatically, sinking deeper into his seat. Worst case, we run out of gas, die of dehydration, and the vultures pick at our bones. That's the spirit, Lena quipped, though the tension in her voice betrayed her bravado. I could feel the same unease creeping into my chest. The gas needle was inching dangerously close to empty, and the desert felt like it was swallowing us whole. We continued driving as the sun sank lower, turning the desert into a surreal landscape of shadow and light. The last rays of daylight flickered on the horizon, and soon the sky was a deep indigo, studded with stars. The temperature dropped quickly, and a biting wind swept across the road. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, eyes scanning for any sign of life, any hope of fuel or shelter. Finally, up ahead, a faint glimmer of light broke through the dark, a neon sign, flickering like a dying firefly. Thank God, Lena breathed, sitting up straighter. I thought we were doomed for sure. I didn't reply. Something about that sign, about the way it flickered so erratically in the distance, didn't feel right. But we didn't have much choice. We were running on fumes. As we got closer, the sign's words became clearer. Last stop, gas open 24 hours. The letters buzzed and hummed, barely holding on, their glow weak and inconsistent. The gas station itself looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned decades ago. The pumps were rusted and covered in dust, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. A single light flickered above the station door, casting a sickly yellow hue over the front. Ugh. This place is a dump, Lena said, wrinkling her nose as we pulled in. It's a gas station, not the Ritz, Eric muttered. Just fill up and let's get out of here. The wind whistled through the cracked windows of the gas station, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes swept the area, but there was nothing. No cars, no signs of life, just the hollow, empty desert stretching out in every direction. I parked next to the pumps, killed the engine, and got out of the car. The air outside was colder than I expected, and it carried the faint scent of something rotting, like decaying wood or spoiled meat. I tried to ignore it, but a pit formed in my stomach as I approached the pump. There was no credit card reader, just an old-fashioned handle that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. You need me to come with you, Lena asked, her voice strained. Nah, it'll be quick, I replied, though part of me wished she'd insisted. I reached for the nozzle, but before I could grab it, something caught my eye, movement in the shadows near the side of the building. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing just out of view, half hidden by the station's rusted walls. It was a man, or at least the shape of one. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my hand hovering over the gas pump, watching him. His face was hidden in shadow, and his posture was unnerving, rigid, as though he'd been standing there for a very long time. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back. Hey, let's hurry up, Lena's voice startled me, snapping me out of my daze. She was leaning out of the window, her eyes darting nervously from the gas station to me. This place is seriously creeping me out. I nodded, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back at the figure. He was gone. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling as I quickly filled the tank. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver down my spine. As soon as the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, I hurried back to the car and jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. "Let's get out of here," I said, starting the engine. Lena was already buckled up, her face pale. "Did you see anyone? I thought I saw someone standing near the building." I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, but he's gone now. Probably just some drifter." Eric leaned forward between the seats, peering out the back window, gone, or watching us drive away. "Can we please not do this right now?" Lena snapped, her voice on edge. "I just want to get out of here." I didn't need any more convincing. I hit the gas, and we sped away from the station, the neon sign flickering in the rearview mirror, until it disappeared into the darkness. For the next few minutes, no one said a word. The desert loomed around us, silent and vast, the sky now a blanket of stars. But the sense of unease didn't leave. It clung to the air like the faint scent of decay that had lingered at the gas station. As the highway stretched ahead, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the car. Eric reached out to adjust it, but before he could, a voice cut through the static. "You shouldn't have stopped." Lena gasped, turning the volume down. What the hell was that? Eric laughed nervously. Probably just a bad signal, interference or something. But the voice returned, clearer this time, as if it were speaking directly to us. "Where do you think you're going?" I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was cold, deliberate, and filled with an odd sense of malice. "Turn it off," I said, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Eric pressed the power button, and the car was plunged back into silence. But the tension inside was palpable. Lena was fidgeting with her seatbelt, her eyes wide as she stared out into the darkness. Then, the car jolted violently. The engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered before cutting out entirely. What the eye slammed the brakes, but the car coasted to a dead stop, the engine silent. We were plunged into complete darkness, the only sound the howling wind and our rapid breathing. No, I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again, my heart racing. Still nothing. "Dude, what's happening?" Eric's voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, trying to hide the panic that was clawing at my throat. Lena fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. No service. Of course. "Great," Eric muttered, glancing out the window. "We're stuck in the middle of nowhere." I sat back in my seat, staring out at the endless stretch of blackness. The desert was still, but there was a weight in the air, a feeling that we weren't alone. My pulse quickened, and I had the sudden, terrifying sense that something was watching us. Then I saw them. Shapes, just beyond the reach of the dim starlight, moving toward the car. At first, they were nothing more than shadows, but as they drew closer, their outlines became clearer figures, human-like but wrong, shambling toward us in slow, deliberate steps. "There's someone out there," Lena whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Eric leaned forward, squinting into the dark. "Who the hell?" I cut him off, my voice tight with fear. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The figures were closing in, their movements slow and unnatural, like puppets on strings. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but their eyes, those glowing, hungry eyes, bored into us. We were trapped. And we weren't alone anymore. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the heart of the Pine Barrens. 5 of us, best friends since high school, were looking forward to 2 days of drinking, hiking, and reminiscing around a campfire. Nothing but the great outdoors and old stories we'd told 1,000 times. No phones, no work, no distractions. The sky was already dark by the time we left the last bit of civilization behind. The only light came from the headlights cutting through the thick, towering trees that lined the narrow dirt road. It felt like we were driving straight into a black tunnel, with only the soft crunch of gravel beneath the tires keeping us grounded. "This place better be worth it," Kim muttered from the back seat, pulling her hoodie tighter around her shoulders. "I swear if this cabin is some rundown shack with no hot water, I'm calling it." "It's not that bad, Alex," my boyfriend said from the driver's seat. He'd been the one who found the place online a deal too good to pass up. It was cheap, isolated, and surrounded by miles of untouched forest. "A perfect getaway," he'd said. "You'll see when we get there. Rustic, sure, but it's all part of the charm." "Rustic is code for falling apart," Kim shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But as long as there's a decent fireplace and something to drink, I won't complain." "Relax," I said, trying to smooth things over. "It's just for 2 days. We'll hike, get some fresh air, and by Sunday you'll be begging to come back." In the back seat, Noah and Jess exchanged a glance. They were the quietest of the group, newly dating and still in that phase where they acted like everything was perfect. Noah, the skeptic, had already voiced his concerns about being this far out in the woods without cell service. But Jess was adventurous, eager to get away from the city, and he'd followed along, albeit with some reluctance. As we rounded a bend in the road, the cabin finally came into view. It was small, nestled among the towering pines like a forgotten relic. The wood siding was weathered, and the single window that faced the road was covered in a layer of grime. The porch sagged slightly, and the only light came from the headlights of our SUV. Charming, Kim deadpanned as Alex parked the car. "Shut up," Alex said, laughing as he turned off the engine. "We're here. Let's make the best of it." We grabbed our bags and stepped out of the car, the cold night air wrapping around us immediately. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distinct scent of pine and damp earth. A strange stillness hung in the air, as though the forest was holding its breath, watching us. "Didn't realize we'd be this far out," Noah muttered, glancing at the dense trees. "No neighbors, huh?" "Nope," Alex said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Just us and nature, peace and quiet." The front door creaked ominously as Alex pushed it open, and we all stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The interior was exactly as described, rustic. A single room with an old stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a creaky-looking set of stairs leading up to a loft. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and definitely no sign of modern conveniences. Just old wooden furniture, dim lighting from a couple of oil lamps, and the pervasive smell of wood smoke. "It's like a time capsule," Jess whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the space. "Kinda cool." "Yeah, cool," Noah muttered. But he was already unpacking, clearly resigned to the situation. Kim dropped her bag on the nearest chair and sighed dramatically. "Well, where's the booze? Let's get this party started." Despite the less than ideal accommodations, we managed to make the best of it. Alex lit a fire, the warmth filling the small cabin, while Noah and Jess uncorked a couple of bottles of wine. Kim found an old stereo system, ancient but surprisingly functional, and soon we had music playing softly in the background as we settled in for the night. As the fire crackled and the wine flowed, the tension melted away. We laughed, told stories from our high school days, and marveled at how much had changed since we'd all gone our separate ways. For a while it felt like we were back in time, like nothing had changed. It was after midnight when the first strange noise interrupted our fun. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the creaking of wood under pressure. At first I thought it was just the cabin settling, but then it came again, louder this time, like footsteps on the porch outside. I froze, my glass of wine halfway to my lips. Did anyone else hear that? Hear what Alex asked, looking over at me, his brow furrowed. "That creaking," I said. "It sounded like someone was outside." Kim rolled her eyes. "It's probably just the wind or the trees or whatever. We're in the middle of the woods, remember." But Noah was already on edge, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the window. "Maybe we should check it out, just in case." Alex shook his head, clearly not concerned. "There's nothing out there. Come on, we're miles from anyone. Who'd be creeping around in the middle of nowhere?" "Bears," Jess offered, her voice light but nervous. "I don't think bears creak like that," I said quietly, my unease growing. Reluctantly, Alex stood up and headed for the door, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen counter. "Fine, I'll check, if it'll make you guys feel better." He opened the door slowly, the hinges squealing, and stepped onto the porch. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping across the empty front yard, illuminating nothing but the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "See? Nothing out here," he called back, his voice tinged with annoyance. But then he paused. The flashlight flickered as if the batteries were dying, casting eerie shadows across the yard. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something movement just beyond the edge of the light, where the trees thickened into darkness. It was gone in an instant, so fast I wasn't even sure if I had really seen it. "Let's just lock the door and call it a night," Noah said, his voice tight. Alex stepped back inside, shaking his head. "You're all paranoid. It's just the woods. We're safe out here." But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. We decided to turn in for the night. The loft had a couple of old, creaky beds, and there was a couch downstairs. Kim and I took the loft, while the others spread out in the living room below. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room as we all settled in, the sounds of the forest creeping into the silence. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the wind outside, my mind replaying that strange creaking sound over and over. Every now and then, I'd hear the house settle, or the rustle of trees, and I'd stiffen, holding my breath. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not outside this time, but inside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, moving across the floor below us. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. I glanced over at Kim, who was sound asleep, completely oblivious to the sound. I wanted to wake her up, but something stopped me. A deep, primal fear. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I lay still, my eyes wide in the dark, waiting, listening. The footsteps started again, this time moving toward the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under the weight of someone or something slowly ascending. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body frozen in place. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as the steps came closer and closer and closer, until they stopped just at the top of the stairs. I could feel something standing there watching, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, slowly moving back down the stairs and across the floor. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the others what I had heard, expecting them to brush it off like they had the night before. But Noah's face went pale when I described the footsteps. "I heard it too," he said quietly, his eyes wide. "I thought it was one of you, but when I looked, everyone was asleep." We all exchanged uneasy glances, the cheerful mood of the previous night completely gone. "I think we should leave," Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex scoffed, though there was a nervous edge to his laughter. "Come on, guys. It's an old house. Of course it makes noise. There's no one out here but us." But none of us were convinced. Not anymore. We packed up quickly, the eerie silence of the woods pressing in on us as we loaded our bags into the car. As we pulled away from the cabin, I couldn't help but glance back at it, half expecting to see someone standing in the window, watching us leave. But the cabin was empty, just as it had been when we arrived. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us. Something unseen, something that had been watching us the whole time. As we drove away, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard it again. Footsteps, following us into the woods. The drive back was cloaked in an unsettling quiet, the air inside the car thick with tension. No one dared to speak, not even to make light of the situation. Alex kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I sat beside him, still trembling, my mind replaying the events from the night before. Kim, who was usually the loudest among us, remained unnervingly silent, staring out the window at the passing trees. She'd slept through the night, oblivious to what Noah and I had heard, but even she seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Noah and Jess were in the back, exchanging worried glances, whispering to each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew they were just as rattled as I was. Noah had heard the footsteps too. That alone was enough to confirm it wasn't some figment of my imagination. Something had been inside that cabin with us, creeping through the darkness. As we wound our way down the narrow road, leaving the dense pines behind, I couldn't help but glance in the side mirror. The cabin had long disappeared from view, but a chill ran down my spine nonetheless. It felt like the woods were still watching us, following us, even as we distanced ourselves from that cursed place. We hadn't even made it an hour out when Alex cursed under his breath. Damn it. What's wrong? I asked, noticing the tension in his voice. Gas lights on, he said, glancing down at the dashboard. We'll have to stop at the next station. I looked around, my heart sinking. The trees had thinned, but there was nothing but open road ahead, no sign of civilization. How far is the next town? Alex grimaced. Not sure. I don't remember passing a station on the way in. Great, Kim muttered, her first words since we'd left the cabin. So we're in the middle of nowhere, with barely any gas left, and we just barely escaped a haunted cabin. Perfect. It's fine, Alex said, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice wavered. We'll find something soon. But as the minutes ticked by and the fuel gauge dipped lower, my anxiety grew. The road stretched endlessly before us, flanked by fields and the occasional cluster of trees, but there was no sign of another car, let alone a gas station. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we spotted a small, weathered sign on the side of the road: gas station 2 miles. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As we pulled into the station, it became clear this wasn't your average pit stop. The building was dilapidated, with a rusting canopy and a single, ancient pump standing forlornly outside. A faded sign above the entrance read, "Harlan's Fill Her Up," in peeling letters. The whole place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Is this place even open? Jess asked, her voice uncertain. Alex pulled up to the pump and shut off the engine. Doesn't look like it, but let's check. We don't have many options. Noah and Alex got out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached the station. I watched them through the window, unease gnawing at my insides. The place looked abandoned, but something about it felt off. Too quiet. Too still. The door to the station was ajar, and after a moment's hesitation, Alex pushed it open. A bell chimed faintly as they stepped inside. Kim, Jess, and I stayed in the car, our eyes locked on the grimy windows of the building, waiting for them to come back out. Minutes passed, then more. They're taking too long, Kim said, glancing at me. What's going on in there? I don't know, I said, my pulse quickening. Maybe the place really is abandoned. Jess shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. Should we go check on them? Before I could answer, the door to the station creaked open, and Alex and Noah emerged. But something was wrong. They both looked pale, shaken, as if they'd seen something they couldn't explain. What happened? I asked as they climbed back into the car. Nothing, Alex muttered, avoiding my gaze. Just, nobody's here. The place is empty. I glanced at Noah, but he wouldn't meet my eyes either. There was something they weren't telling us. Did you get gas? Kim asked, her impatience clear. Yeah, Alex said, starting the car. Let's just get out of here. We pulled away from the station, the rusty pump receding into the distance as we sped down the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the air, that whatever had been in that cabin hadn't stayed behind. It had followed us. As we continued driving, the landscape began to change. The once familiar trees and fields gave way to something more unsettling. The sky, which had been clear and blue just an hour ago, now hung heavy with thick, dark clouds. The sunlight dimmed, casting long shadows across the road. We should have been back by now, Noah muttered from the back seat, glancing at his phone. We've been driving for hours. I frowned, checking the time on the dashboard. He was right. We should have reached the main highway by now, but instead the road seemed to stretch endlessly before us, winding through unfamiliar terrain. I don't remember this road, Alex said, gripping the wheel tighter. His voice was tense, strained. It's the only road, Kim snapped. How can you not remember it? But I knew what Alex meant. The road looked different, wrong somehow. The trees pressed in closer, their branches knotted and twisted like grasping fingers. The sky overhead was unnaturally dark, as if the world itself had shifted into something unfamiliar, something sinister. "Did we take a wrong turn?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. "No," Alex insisted, but his voice lacked confidence. "I'm sure we're on the right road." Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, a person standing in the middle of the road, completely still. Alex slammed on the brakes, and we all lurched forward as the car screeched to a halt just feet away from the figure. It was an old man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He stood there, staring at us with hollow eyes, his expression unreadable. "What the hell?" Noah muttered, his eyes wide. Alex honked the horn, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, blocking our way, his gaze fixed on the car. "Go around him," Kim hissed, her voice trembling. "Just drive." Alex hesitated, then slowly edged the car forward, steering around the man. As we passed him, I couldn't help but look into his eyes, those empty, soulless eyes that seemed to follow us even as we left him behind. The car sped up, but the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper into the darkened woods. The further we drove, the more the landscape twisted into something nightmarish. The trees were no longer just trees, they were warped, twisted things with gnarled branches that reached out like claws. The road itself seemed to pulse, as if alive, dragging us deeper into its depths. "We're not getting out of here," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're trapped." "Don't say that," I muttered, my heart racing. "We just need to keep going. We'll find the highway soon." But deep down I wasn't so sure. As the car sped along the endless road, the sky grew darker, the clouds churning overhead like a storm waiting to break. And in the distance, just beyond the trees, I could have sworn I heard the soft creak of footsteps. Following us. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, one of those getaways where you escape the noise of the city and recharge with fresh air and nature. 5 of us, Jake, Sarah, Tom, Lisa, and me, had decided to visit an old cabin up in the mountains, a place we'd rented from some obscure website Jake found. A little off the grid, sure, but Jake had vouched for it, saying the reviews were positive, and that's all we needed to hear. The drive started off normal enough, with the sun setting behind us and the radio playing low as we wound through long stretches of country roads. The cabin was about 6 hours from the city, nestled deep in the woods. We planned to spend 2 nights there, hiking during the day and enjoying the stars and bonfire at night. A perfect escape, or so we thought. After 4 hours of driving, we reached a stretch of road that didn't appear on our GPS silent road, read the old, rusted street sign barely visible under years of weathering. The main highway was blocked off due to a recent landslide, so Jake suggested we take this detour. "Silent road, huh?" Sarah chuckled from the back seat. "Sounds like something out of a horror movie." Lisa, sitting beside her, laughed. "Yeah, watch out for the chainsaw-wielding maniac guys." Tom, sitting in the passenger seat, gave me a side eye. Drove. "Maybe this was a bad idea." Come on, it's just a name," I replied, trying to keep the mood light. "We'll be fine." So we turned onto Silent Road, the car bumping slightly as the tires rolled over cracked asphalt. So trees here seemed denser, the branches hanging low, casting long shadows that danced across the car as we passed under them. The road itself was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and it snaked through the forest in sharp, jagged turns. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, the uneasy feeling creeping in the moment we turned onto that road. After about 30 minutes, the atmosphere had completely changed. The temperature seemed to drop, and a thick mist rolled in, wrapping itself around the trees like a suffocating blanket. I turned the headlights to high, but it didn't seem to penetrate the fog. The road ahead was only visible for a few feet before vanishing into the thick white haze. "This is weird," Sarah said quietly, her earlier joking tone replaced by uncertainty. "We'll be fine," Jake said, though he didn't sound so sure anymore. The road began to narrow even more, the trees almost pressing in on us. I slowed the car down, my eyes scanning the sides of the road for any signs of life or markers. But there was nothing, no street signs, no other cars, no lights, just an endless tunnel of trees and that impenetrable mist that clung to everything. And then, out of nowhere, the headlights illuminated something up ahead. A figure. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a stop. We all lurched forward in our seats, hearts pounding in our chests. The figure stood in the middle of the road, completely still. At first it looked like a person, but something about it was off. So the figure was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, or what looked like a black tattered cloak, and its face, well, it didn't seem to have a face. Just darkness where its features should have been. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, his voice tight with fear. No one answered. We just sat there staring at the figure in the headlights, our breaths on the hiss, in a collective silence. I honked the horn, hoping maybe foolishly that it was just someone messing with us. But the figure didn't move. It didn't flinch, didn't react at all. It just stood there, blocking the road like it was waiting for something. "Go around it," Jake urged from the back seat, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Slowly I turned the wheel and edged the car forward, maneuvering around the fist. As we passed by, I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look directly at it. But Sarah couldn't help herself. "Oh my God," she gasped, clutching Lisa's arm. It turned its head. "It's watching us." My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept driving, accelerating as soon as we cleared the figure. The road ahead was just as empty and foggy as before, but now there was a growing sense of dread. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see. For while no one said anything, the tension in the car was palpable, everyone lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to admit that maybe we'd just seen something we couldn't explain. "We need to get off this road," Tom finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "This place, it's not right." "I know," I agreed, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, "but there's nowhere to turn off." We kept driving, the mist growing thicker, the road winding deeper into the forest. It felt like we'd been on that road for hours, but the GPS still wasn't picking up any signal. It was like we were driving in circles, trapped in some kind of loop. So then, out of the mist, we saw something up ahead, another figure standing in the middle of the road. "No," Lisa whispered, her voice shaky. It can't be." But it was. The same figure from before, tall, cloaked, faceless, standing perfectly still, right where he'd passed it earlier. I slammed on the brakes again, my stomach churning with dread. This time no one said a word. We all knew this wasn't possible, that there was no way the figure could have gotten ahead of us. Yet there it was, standing as if it had never moved. Slowly it began to raise its arm, pointing down the road ahead. Its long, bony finger extended toward the fog, beckoning us to continue. "We're not going that way," I said firmly, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "We don't have a choice," Jake whispered, his face pale. "There's no other way?" I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But we were lost, and the road was too narrow to turn around without risking going off into the trees. With a shaky breath, I pressed on the gas, driving past the figure once more. This time I couldn't resist the urge to look at it. As we passed, I caught a glimpse of its face or lack thereof. The darkness where its eyes should have been seemed to pulse, drawing me in. I quickly looked away, my heart racing, but the image was burned into my mind. The road continued, twisting and turning through the woods, and every time I thought we were getting closer to an escape, the figure would appear again. Always ahead of us, always standing in the same spot as if it were leading us somewhere. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe it was just minutes, it was impossible to tell. Time felt distorted, stretched out like we were stuck in some kind of purgatory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road opened up into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit house. Its windows were dark, its wooden frame rotting and covered in vines. The front door hung slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for us. "No," Lisa breathed, shaking her head. "We're not going in there." "We don't have a choice," Jake said, his voice hollow. "It's where the road led us." I parked the car, my hands shaking. No one moved at first, too terrified to leave the safety of the vehicle. But we couldn't stay there forever. The fog was thickening around us, closing in, and that figure was out there, somewhere in the mist. Slowly, we climbed out of the car, our footsteps crunching on the gravel as we approached the house. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the wind howled through the trees like a warning. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a dark, empty hallway. The air inside was heavy with smell of rot and decay. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside, our hearts pounding in our chests. The house was silent, too silent. No sound except for our breathing and the occasional creak of the old wood. We split up, cautiously exploring the rooms. Dust covered every surface, and the walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper that peeled in long strips. In the living room, I found an old, rusted mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was cloudy, but I could still see my reflection in it, or at least I thought I could. As I looked closer, I noticed something was off. My reflection didn't move when I did. It just stared back at me, its eyes wide and unblinking. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but Before I could say anything, the door behind me slammed shut, the lights flickered, and then everything went dark. Panic set in. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead, no signal, no light. I called out for the others, but the only response was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the halls. And then a whisper. "Welcome home." They called it Black Hollow Woods, a stretch of forest that locals swore was cursed. Everyone in town had a different story about why some said witches once lived there, casting spells that left the trees twisted and gnarled. Others said a massacre had taken place during the early settler days, and the land had never recovered from the blood spilled upon it. Some even claimed that the woods were a gateway to another world, a realm where the dead walked among the living. For years, the stories kept people away, but to my friends and me, it sounded like the perfect place for a camping trip. We weren't superstitious, and we were always looking for a thrill. So when my best friend Mason brought up the idea of spending the weekend at Black Hollow, I didn't hesitate. It was supposed to be an adventure, a break from the monotony of our small town lives. Mason, Sarah, Noah, Claire, and I had all been friends since high school, and now that we were out of college and working dead-end jobs, we needed a getaway more than ever. Black Hollow seemed like the perfect place to escape, with no cell service, no internet, and no responsibilities. Just the five of us, a campfire, and the wilderness. We packed up the car with tents, sleeping bags, food, and enough booze to last us the weekend. The drive took about 2 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads as we got closer to the forest. The sun was starting to set by the time we arrived, casting long shadows over the tree lane. The moment we stepped out of the car, I could feel it, the weight of the woods. There was something different about this place, something heavy in the air. The trees were taller than any I'd ever seen, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, almost as if they were reaching out for us. But none of us said anything. We weren't about to let some creepy vibes ruin our trip. "We're here," Mason announced, spreading his arms wide like he was welcoming us to a 5-star resort. Sarah rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're too excited about this." So Mason grinned. "You'll thank me when we're sitting around the fire with a couple of beers." We grabbed our gear and started walking into the woods. There wasn't much of a trail, just a narrow dirt path that wound between the trees. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Even though the sun hadn't fully set, the thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the remaining light, plunging the forest into an eerie twilight. After about 20 minutes, we found a small clearing where we could set up camp. It was surrounded by trees on all sides, with just enough space for our tents and a fire pit. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves, and the air smelled damp and earthy. As we started pitching our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around, but of course there was no one there, just the trees towering over us like silent sentinels. "Something wrong?" Noah asked, noticing my hesitation. "Nah," I said, shaking off the unease. "Just feels a little weird, you know?" He nodded, but he didn't look worried. "It's probably just the stories getting to you. Once we get the fire going, it'll feel more normal." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. By the time we had everything set up, night had fully fallen and the forest was cloaked in darkness. Mason started a fire and we gathered around, cracking open beers and passing around snacks. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and for a little while it felt like any other camping trip. We laughed, told stories, and joked about how we were probably going to end up being one of those groups in a horror movie. "Can you imagine if we actually saw something out here?" Sarah said, her eyes wide with mock fear. "Like, I don't know, a ghost or a monster." "Don't even joke about that," Claire said, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. She had always been the most superstitious of the group. I heard some pretty messed up stories about this place. Mason leaned forward, grinning. "Oh yeah, like what?" Claire hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the dark trees. "Well, there's the story about the Black Hollow Witch." "Witch?" Mason raised an eyebrow. "Do tell." Claire took a deep breath, clearly trying to psych herself up for telling the story. "Okay, so this is what I heard from my grandma. Apparently back in the 1800s, there was this woman who lived in Black Hollow. She was an herbalist, made medicines and salves from the plants in the forest, but the townspeople thought she was a witch. They blamed her for everything that went wrong, sick livestock, poor crops, even deaths. They said she was cursed, and that she was bringing ruin to the town. Sarah shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. I don't like where this is going. Claire continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. One night, a group of men from the town dragged her out of her cabin, tied her to a tree, and set her on fire. They say her screams echoed through the woods for hours, but by the time the flames died down, her body was gone. I just vanished. The townspeople thought they were rid of her, but after that, strange things started happening in the woods. People would go missing, and anyone who entered Black Hollow would hear her voice whispering through the trees. They say she's still out there wandering the forest, waiting for revenge. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on our faces. For a moment, no one spoke. That's bullshit, Mason finally said, breaking the silence. There's no such thing as witches. Maybe, Claire said, her eyes darting to the trees again. But a lot of people have gone missing out here. Noah laughed, though it sounded forced. Yeah, and I'm sure they just got lost. This place is huge. If you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get turned around. Or maybe the witch got them, Sarah whispered, her voice teasing but uneasy. We all laughed, but the mood had shifted. The fire didn't feel quite as warm anymore, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway ominously. Let's just enjoy the weekend, I said, trying to lighten the atmosphere. No witches, no ghosts. Just us and the woods. But the unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. That night I had trouble sleeping. I could hear the wind howling through the trees, and every now and then there was a rustling sound that made my heart race. I told myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, but every noise seemed too close, too deliberate, like footsteps. Around midnight I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. And some whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. A woman's voice, soft and eerie, whispering something I couldn't understand. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from just outside the tent. I glanced over at Noah, who was asleep in the tent next to mine. His breathing was steady, completely unaware of the sound that was filling my ears. Slowly I unzipped the tent and peeked out. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The woods were dark, the trees towering over the clearing like silent giants. But there was no one there. The whispering stopped. I climbed out of the tent, my breath visible in the cold air. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, but the clearing was empty. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, but all I saw were shadows. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved again. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step back, my mouth dry with fear. The figure was a woman. She stood still, her head tilted slightly to one side, her hair long and matted, hanging over her face like a veil. Her clothes were torn, dirty, and covered in what looked like ash, and her eyes, when I finally saw them, were black, like two endless voids staring straight at me. I froze, my legs refusing to move. The woman didn't make a sound, didn't move toward me. She just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, without warning, she vanished. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stumbled back into my tent, my heart racing, and zipped it up tight. I sat there for hours, too afraid to sleep, listening to the wind howl outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those black, empty eyes staring at me from the shadows. The next morning, I didn't say anything to the others. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it was just a dream. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. That day, we went hiking deeper into the woods, exploring the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, watching us from just beyond the tree line. Every now and then I thought I saw movement, just a glimpse, a shadow darting between the trees, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. The others didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't say anything. We spent the day walking, laughing, pretending that everything was fine. But I could feel the tension building. The woods were getting to us. By the time we got back to the camp, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. We built the fire back up, but the mood was different tonight. No one joked about witches or ghosts. We just sat in silence, staring into the flames, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As the night wore on, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a mournful wail. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the ground. And then, just as it had the night before, I heard it again. The whispering. It started faint, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. This time I wasn't the only one who heard it. Sarah's eyes went wide and she looked at me, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my stomach twisting with fear. The others heard it too. Mason's bravado was gone, replaced by a look of fear that I'd never seen on his face before. The whispering surrounded us, coming from all directions. It was the same voice as before, a woman's voice, soft and chilling, speaking words I couldn't understand. But there was something else now, something in the air. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the woods were closing in around us. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. We scrambled to gather our things, our hands shaking as we packed up as quickly as we could. The whispering grew louder, filling the air, echoing through the trees. And then, just as we were about to leave the clearing, I saw her again. The woman. She stood at the edge of the trees, watching us with those black, soulless eyes. Her face was twisted into a mask of rage, and as I met her gaze, the whispering turned into a scream, a blood-curdling, bone-chilling scream that pierced the night. We ran. Branches whipped at our faces, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath our feet. The scream followed us, echoing through the trees, getting louder with every step. I could hear the others shouting, their voices filled with fear, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. I didn't stop running until we reached the car, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. We threw our bags into the trunk and piled into the car, Mason slamming his foot on the gas. As we sped away, I glanced out the window and saw her one last time, the woman standing at the edge of the road, watching us leave. Her eyes followed us, even as we disappeared into the night. We never spoke about what happened in Black Hollow Woods, not to each other, not to anyone. We tried to move on, to forget, but I could never shake the feeling that we'd escaped something far worse than we could ever imagine. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can still hear her whispering my name. The car ride back to town was filled with the heavy silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The vibrant laughter and light-hearted teasing the previous days had vanished, replaced by an oppressive weight that settled in this. It kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her shadow lurking just beyond the tree line. But the road stretched empty behind us. Did that really just happen? Noah finally broke the silence, his voice shaky. It felt so real. Mason tightened his grip on the steering wheel, knuckles white. Real or not, we need to stay the hell away from that place. Claire, who had been staring out her window, turned to face the group. We should tell someone, report it to the authorities or something. People need to know. About what? Mason snapped, glancing at her. That we went camping and saw a ghost? They'll think we're crazy. They need to know about the disappearances, Claire insisted, her voice rising. If that place is dangerous, we can't just ignore it. Dangerous? Sarah scoffed, her voice laced with disbelief. You really think it was a ghost? I don't know what it was, Claire said, her voice shaking, but I vote I saw. And if we don't do something, someone else could get hurt. The tension in the car was palpable. Each of us had our own memories of the witch's scream. The feeling of being watched, the chilling presence of the woman in the woods. We didn't have answers, only questions that gnawed at us like a relentless hunger. We finally reached town, the familiar sights offering little comfort. The dim streetlights flickered as if hesitant to illuminate our path. We pulled into the parking lot of the diner, the only place still open at this hour. The neon sign buzzed above us, casting a sickly glow over the pavement. Mason parked the car and we all stepped out, the chill of the night wrapping around us like a cold shroud. As we walked toward the diner, I could feel the weight of the woods still pressing down on me. It was as if Black Hollow had left a mark on us, a stain we couldn't wash away. Inside the diner was mostly empty, save for a few late-night patrons nursing cups of coffee, so the smell of grease and burnt toast hung in the air, familiar and grounding. We slid into a booth in the corner, the vinyl seats squeaking beneath us. What do we do? Noah asked, running a hand through his hair. Do we tell someone or just pretend this never happened? Pretending won't make it go away, Claire said, her voice firm. We have to at least warn people about Black Hollow. Like who? Sarah shot back. The sheriff. They'll laugh at us. I stared at the table, tracing the grooves in the wood with my finger. What if we just investigate? Go back during the day, take a look around? We could figure out what's really going on. Are you out of your mind? Mason's voice was sharp. You want to go back there? After everything? I swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. I think we need to understand what we're dealing with. If it's just a ghost story, then fine. But if there's something more to it? What's there to understand? Noah interjected, his voice tense. We saw something that scared us out of our minds. What if we go back and it's worse? It can't be worse than hearing that scream, Sarah added, her eyes wide with fear. We fell into silence again, the weight of our fears pressing down on us like a thick fog. I could feel my heart racing as I considered my options. Part of me wanted to leave it all behind, to move on with my life, and pretend Black Hollow was just a figment of our imaginations. But another part of me felt drawn back, like a moth to a flame. Claire nodded, a spark of determination igniting in her eyes. That's all I want. We need to find out what's really happening there. As we finished our late-night diner food, I could see the resolve building among us. We would face our fears head-on, even if it meant returning to the haunted woods. The decision hung in the air like an unspoken promise, binding us together in our quest for answers. The next day, we set out for Black Hollow Woods again, but this time under the bright light of the sun. The drive felt different, less thrilling, and more like a chore. The trees lined the road like sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. As we approached the entrance to the woods, my heart began to race again. "Remember, we're just looking," Mason said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nerves. "No stupid dares, no splitting up. We stick together." We parked at the edge of the woods, where the gravel crunched beneath our feet as we stepped out. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It almost looked peaceful. "Let's go," Claire said, determination in her stride. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The chirping of birds was barely audible, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The ground was uneven, and the trees loomed overhead, their trunks twisted and gnarled, creating a maze that felt alive. "Do you guys feel that?" Noah said, glancing around nervously. "It's like everything is watching us." I nodded, feeling a chill creep down my spine. The whispers of the past lingered in the air, wrapping around us like a forgotten melody. The further we went, the more the light seemed to dim, even though the sun was high in the sky. After about an hour of walking, we reached the clearing where we had set up camp. It looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but still shrouded in a heavy atmosphere. The fire pit was cold, surrounded by the remnants of our previous adventure. We spread out, searching for any signs of what could have happened. "Look at this," Sarah called, crouching near a large tree at the edge of the clearing. "There's something carved into the bark." We gathered around her, peering at the symbols etched into the tree. They were unfamiliar twisted lines and shapes that looked almost like runes. "And do you think this is what people were talking about?" Claire asked, tracing her fingers over the markings, like maybe this is part of the witch's curse. "Creepy," Noah muttered, stepping back. "Maybe we shouldn't mess with it." Mason leaned in closer, squinting at the carvings. "There's something off about this place. I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone." Just then, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves and causing a chill to settle over us. I shivered, glancing around nervously. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't quite place. "Let's move on," I suggested, trying to shake off the growing unease. "There's got to be more to see." We continued deeper into the woods, following a narrow path that twisted between the trees. The air grew cooler and the sunlight dimmed even further as we ventured further from the clearing. Every crack of a twig and underfoot felt amplified, echoing in the heavy silence. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small stream, its water crystal clear but freezing cold. The sound of trickling water was almost soothing against the backdrop of our frayed nerves. We paused to rest, taking in the tranquility of the moment. "Maybe we were just overreacting last night," Sarah said, dipping her fingers into the water. "This place isn't so bad." But just as she spoke, I felt a sharp tug on my shirt. I turned, startled, but there was nothing there, just the trees, standing tall and silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Did you see that?" I asked, looking around at the others. Something just tugged on my shirt. They all exchanged glances, uncertainty written on their faces. "Are you sure you weren't just imagining it?" Noah asked. "Maybe the woods are playing tricks on us," Claire said, trying to lighten the mood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond our sight, hidden among the shadows. As we resumed our exploration, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The path we followed started to narrow, the trees closing in around us, blocking out the sunlight. The whispering returned, faint at first, but gradually becoming louder and more distinct. It was the same voice, the woman's voice calling out to us. "Do you hear that?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's getting closer." Panic surged within me. "We need to go back. This isn't right." But before we could turn around, a figure emerged from the shadows, a young girl, no older than 10, with wild, tangled hair and dirt-streaked clothes. She looked disheveled and lost, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me." "What's wrong?" Claire asked, taking a cautious step forward. "Where are your parents?" "They're gone. They left me." The girl's voice rose in pitch, desperation spilling out of her. "When you have to come with me?" "She's coming?" "Who's coming?" Noah asked, glancing at the rest of us, confusion etched on his face. But before the girl could answer, she turned and bolted deeper into the woods, disappearing between the trees. We exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. "Should we follow her?" Mason asked, hesitating. "No way. We can't just leave her." Claire insisted, determination in her eyes. "Are you crazy?" Noah exclaimed. That's what we were trying to escape from? But before anyone could respond, the whispering intensified, a cacophony of voices rising in urgency. The trees around us creaked and groaned, almost as if they were alive, swaying ominously. "We have to go," I shouted, my heart racing. "Now?" We turned to flee back the way we came, but as we raced through the underbrush, I felt the air change. It was heavy, almost electric, and the whispering morphed into something far more sinister, laughter, cruel and mocking, echoing all around us. "Run!" Mason shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. The world around us felt disorienting as we pushed through the branches, tripping over roots and stumbling into one another. My breath came in ragged gasps, fear fueling my legs as I tried to keep pace with my friends. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw her again, the woman with the black eyes. And she stood at the edge of our path, blocking our way. Her expression twisted into a chilling smile that sent a shock of terror through me. "To leave now or stay forever?" she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. I skidded to a stop, the others barely managing to avoid crashing into me. The laughter echoed in the trees, mingling with the woman's words, creating a haunting symphony of despair. "Don't listen to her,"